In the autumn of 1990, a removal lorry backed up to a works entrance on Bisley Road, Sparkbrook, Birmingham. The men loading it were not salvage contractors. They were precision engineers, the kind whose hands had spent decades calibrating barrel bedding to tolerances measured in thousandths of an inch. What they loaded into that lorry was not furniture or office equipment. It was the accumulated tooling, jigs and gauges of a target rifle manufacturing operation that had equipped British Olympic shooters across 3 consecutive games, supplied military sniper systems to the armed forces of Australia, Canada, New Zealand, and half a dozen NATO allies, and placed more winning shots at Bisley Camp than any other British production rifle of the post-war era. The destination was Martinsburg, West Virginia. Not Sheffield, not Coventry, not even London. West Virginia. 10 years earlier, Parker-Hale's Model 82 had been formally adopted as the standard sniper rifle of the Australian Army, the Canadian Armed Forces, and the New Zealand Defence Force. 6 nations carried it into the field. Military procurement officers on 3 continents had examined it, trialed it, and chosen it above everything else available. The Birmingham proof mark was on every barrel. The Bisley Road address was on every receiver. The British Army had chosen something else. But the real story of Parker-Hale is not the lorry on Bisley Road, and it is not the contract that went to Accuracy International instead. It is the story of what Birmingham's gun quarter built across 90 years of precision manufacturing. The patents, the proof marks, the podium finishes, and the quiet institutional decisions that dismantled it all without a single public announcement. Every week, we tell the stories of the engineers, the works, and the decisions that built or destroyed the world's most important firearms brands. Give the video a like and subscribe if you want to keep hearing them. The story begins in Birmingham in the closing years of the 19th century. Birmingham, in the 1890s, was the most productive arms manufacturing center on Earth, and also, paradoxically, one of the most fragmented. The gun quarter, clustered around St. Mary's Row, Weeman Street, and Lench Street in the city's north, was not a factory. It was an ecosystem. A finished Birmingham sporting rifle passed through a dozen pairs of hands before it reached a dealer's rack. The barrel maker on one street, the lock maker on the next, the stocker working from a garret above a hardware merchant, the finisher operating from a single room with a bench, a vise, and 40 years of accumulated judgment. Each man was a specialist, each subcontracted to the next. The system had operated on those streets, in those configurations, since the 1690s, and it worked in the way that centuries-old systems work, efficiently within its own logic and almost entirely resistant to outside pressure to change. Alfred Gray Parker understood that system from the inside. He had come up through the trade in the way most Birmingham gunmakers came up, through proximity, apprenticeship, and the particular education that comes from watching a skilled man work and being permitted in time to work alongside him. The exact year of his entry into independent business is not recorded with certainty in surviving trade directories. By the mid-1890s, however, Parker was operating as a gun maker and dealer in the Birmingham commercial trade, his name appearing in the Proof House submission records that the Birmingham Proof House on Banbury Street, established by Act of Parliament in 1813 as the statutory body responsible for testing every commercially produced firearm barrel before sale, maintained as a matter of legal requirement, a barrel that passed proof received the Birmingham proof mark, a crowned letter and a set of numerals stamped into the metal flat, the legal guarantee that the barrel had withstood a deliberate overload charge without failure. A barrel that failed was destroyed on the bench. Parker's barrels passed. Arthur Hale brought a complementary formation, where Parker's strength was in the commercial gun trade, in the dealer relationships, the proof house familiarity, the understanding of what the Birmingham market could produce and at what price. Hale's orientation was toward the accessory and maintenance side of the arms business. The cleaning rods, the oil bottles, the pull-throughs and chamber brushes that every rifle owner required and that the gun quarter produced in volume alongside the guns themselves. It was not, in the hierarchy of the trade, the glamorous end of the business. It was, however, the end that never stopped selling. Wars began and ended. Procurement contracts shifted. Fashions in sporting calibers came and went, but every man who owned a rifle needed to clean it, and needed the tools to do so reliably, repeatedly, without damaging the barrel that the proof house had certified. The gap they identified was not in cleaning equipment. That market existed, and they would serve it. The gap was in the target shooting trade. By the 1890s, British target shooting had outgrown the equipment available to it. The National Rifle Association, founded in 1859 and based at Bisley Camp in Surrey from 1890, the year the camp opened, the same decade Parker and Hale were establishing their partnership, had created a competitive infrastructure that demanded a level of precision the standard Birmingham sporting trade was not consistently producing. A match rifle for Bisley competition was a different object from a game gun or a service arm. It required a barrel bedded with a consistency that the subcontract system, for all its centuries of refinement, was not organized to deliver at scale. It required action tolerances and trigger geometries that a garret workshop, however skilled its occupant, could not hold from one unit to the next. Parker and Hale saw it. More precisely, they saw that no one in the Birmingham gun quarter was addressing it systematically. That observation, made somewhere in the closing years of Victoria's reign, on a street in the gun quarter within walking distance of the proof house that would stamp every barrel they ever made, became the founding logic of everything that followed. The first thing Parker-Hale understood that most of the Birmingham trade did not was the difference between a rifle that shot accurately and a rifle that shot accurately every time. The distinction sounds trivial. In the target shooting world of Edwardian Britain, it was everything. A match rifle built for Bisley competition, for the long-range stages at 900 and 1,000 yards across the Surrey Heath, where a wind flag misread by a fraction meant the difference between a center and an outer, demanded a level of mechanical consistency that the subcontract system's garret workshops were not organized to deliver. The problem was not skill. The Birmingham gun quarter contained some of the most accomplished hand fitters in the world. The problem was repeatability. A lock spring filed by one craftsman in one workshop on a Tuesday morning would not reproduce exactly the trigger geometry filed by a different craftsman in a different workshop on a Thursday afternoon. Both might be excellent. Neither would be identical. And at 1,000 yards, the difference between excellent and identical was the difference between a winning score and an also-ran. Parker-Hale's answer was integration. Rather than subcontracting across the quarter in the traditional Birmingham pattern, the firm brought critical operations, barrel fitting, action bedding, trigger adjustment, under direct supervision within their own works. This was not, in the 1900s, a revolutionary concept in industrial terms. BSA at Small Heath had operated on integrated production principles since the 1860s. But for a sporting and target rifle maker working in the commercial trade rather than the military supply chain, it represented a deliberate break from the ecosystem that had formed both founders. The rifle that announced Parker-Hale to the serious target shooting market was chambered in .303 British, the standard military cartridge adopted by the British Army in 1889 for the Lee Metford and subsequently the Lee Enfield, a rimmed bottlenecked cartridge firing a 174-grain projectile at approximately 2,440 feet per second from a 25-inch barrel. Using the military cartridge was a considered commercial decision. The ammunition was available everywhere. The ballistics were well understood by every serious British target shooter, and the military familiarity meant that returned servicemen, a growing demographic after the Boer War and within a decade after a rather larger conflict, could transition to competition shooting without relearning a cartridge from the beginning. What Parker-Hale contributed was the barrel. Birmingham barrel making, at its best, was among the finest in the world. Parker-Hale invested in the cold draw and button rifling processes that produced a bore of exceptional internal consistency. A rifled barrel, in plain terms, being a tube of steel whose interior surface has been cut or pressed with a series of spiral grooves that impart a stabilizing spin to the projectile as it travels from chamber to muzzle. The consistency of those grooves, their depth, their twist rate, and the uniformity of the bore diameter between them determines directly how consistently the projectile will leave the muzzle at the same angle, the same velocity, and the same spin from one shot to the next. A barrel with even microscopic variations in bore diameter across its length introduces dispersion that no shooter's technique can compensate for at 1,000 yards. Parker-Hale barrels, submitted to the Birmingham Proof House on Banbury Street and stamped with the Birmingham Proof mark before leaving the works, were known in the Bisley trade for that consistency, not by reputation built on advertising, by result, by the scores posted at NRA meetings, by the names that appeared in the prize lists of the Queen's Prize and the St. George's Challenge Vase, by the quiet word between serious competitors that the Birmingham firm on Bisley Road was producing something the standard trade was not. The cleaning equipment operation ran alongside the rifle trade from the earliest years. A Parker-Hale pull-through, a weighted cord passed through the bore from breech to muzzle, drawing a cleaning patch behind it to remove propellant fouling from the rifling grooves, was sold through gun dealers across Britain at prices that placed it within reach of every rifle owner, not merely the competition shooter. By the first decade of the 20th century, Parker-Hale cleaning rods, oil bottles, and chamber brushes were standard catalogue items at the Army and Navy stores on Victoria Street, London, the great cooperative emporium that supplied the British officer class with everything from service dress to camping equipment to the tools required to maintain the Lee Enfield that the War Office had placed in their hands. The price differential told the market exactly what Parker-Hale was. A standard Birmingham trade target rifle of the period, adequate, proof-marked, built to the commercial specification that served most buyers, could be had for £3 to £4 from a gun quarter dealer. A Parker-Hale match-grade rifle, action-bedded and barrel-selected to competition specification, commanded £6 to £8, roughly 3 weeks' wages for a skilled Birmingham gun worker in 1905, and a price that communicated, without any further explanation required, that the buyer was not purchasing an adequate rifle. They were purchasing a specific result. The Bisley market accepted the price. The scores justified it. By the time the First World War ended, Parker-Hale was no longer simply a target rifle maker with a cleaning equipment sideline. It was a name the British military already trusted, not for rifles, not yet, but for the tools that kept rifles serviceable under conditions that destroyed everything else. The Lee Enfield. The bolt-action service rifle that armed the British and Commonwealth soldier through 2 world wars, a rimmed .303 caliber weapon whose 10-round magazine and smooth cock-on closing bolt allowed a trained infantryman to deliver 15 aimed rounds per minute, a rate of fire that German infantry at Mons in August 1914 initially reported as machine gun fire, required maintenance with a precision and regularity that field conditions made almost impossible. Mud at Parker-Hale, sand at Gaza, the monsoonal humidity of Mesopotamia. Each environment attacked the bore, the bolt face, the extractor, and the magazine platform in different ways, at different rates, with different consequences. A Lee Enfield that had not been pulled through after 48 hours in the forward trenches was a rifle whose bore fouling had begun to affect accuracy. After 72 hours without attention, it was a liability. Parker-Hale pull-throughs, oil bottles, and cleaning rods were issued alongside the rifles, not as optional accessories, as standard equipment, as part of the military logistical chain that the Army Ordnance Corps administered across every theater of the Great War. The Parker-Hale name was on the equipment pouches of infantrymen in the Ypres salient, on the supply manifests at Gallipoli, and in the armorers' stores at base depots from Etaples to Alexandria. The firm had not sought a War Office contract in the dramatic sense of a competitive tender for a principal weapon system. They had done something quieter, and in some respects more durable. They had made themselves indispensable to the maintenance of a weapon system that someone else had designed. That institutional relationship survived the armistice. It survived the interwar reductions. It survived the defense cuts of the 1920s and the hollowing out of the British rearmament program through the 1930s. When the Second World War came and the Lee Enfield No. 4 Mark I, a refined version of the original pattern, with an aperture rear sight and a heavier barrel, adopted in 1941 as the standard British service rifle, was produced at government arsenals and licensed factories across Britain, Canada, and India, at a rate that would eventually exceed 17 million units across all variants and all manufacturers. Parker-Hale cleaning equipment went with every one of them that passed through British military supply. The stakes were not abstract. A No. 4 Lee Enfield whose bore had been neglected in the Western Desert Campaign lost measurable accuracy at 300 yards within a week of sustained use without cleaning. At 500 yards, the standard engagement range at which a British infantryman was expected to deliver effective fire, a fouled bore was the difference between a hit and a miss against a target that was shooting back. Parker-Hale's pull-through, drawn through the bore from breech to muzzle by its weighted cord, removing propellant residue and copper fouling from the rifling grooves in a single controlled motion, was the 30-second procedure that kept that margin from closing. 30 seconds, once a day, with a piece of Birmingham-made equipment that cost the War Department less per unit than a service boot eyelet. The Second World War also brought Parker-Hale into the precision optics and mounting business. Telescope sight mounts, the machined steel brackets that attach a telescopic sight to a rifle's receiver, allowing a trained sniper to engage targets at ranges beyond the iron sight's practical limit, were produced at the Bisley Road Works for the No. 4 Mark I T, the designated sniper variant of the Lee Enfield, fitted with a number 32 telescope sight and issued to trained snipers across the British and Commonwealth forces from 1942 onward. The work required the same barrel-bedding precision that had defined Parker-Hale's target rifle trade. It was, in that sense, the military application of everything the firm had built at Bisley, applied now not to a competition shooter on a Surrey heath, but to a sniper in a hide on the Normandy bocage or the Burmese jungle, where the quality of the mount determined whether the shot landed or did not. The post-war years brought the competition record that placed Parker-Hale in a category no other Birmingham sporting arms firm of the era could claim. The National Rifle Association's program at Bisley Camp, the annual gathering of the most serious target shooters in Britain and the Commonwealth, held on the Surrey heathland that had been the home of British long-range rifle competition since 1890. Became the primary arena in which Parker-Hale rifles demonstrated what the Bisley Road Works was capable of. The Queen's Prize, the oldest and most prestigious individual competition in British target shooting, first held at Wimbledon Common in 1860 and transferred to Bisley with the NRA in 1890, was won with Parker-Hale equipment by competitors whose names appeared in the NRA prize lists with a regularity that the trade noticed. The St. George's Challenge Vase, the Colapore Cup, the imperial team competition that brought shooters from across the Commonwealth to Bisley each July, firing alongside British service and civilian competitors in a contest whose results were reported in the military press as seriously as any regimental honor. At the Commonwealth Games, the imperial sporting gathering that placed marksmanship events alongside athletics and swimming as a measure of sporting excellence across the British world, Parker-Hale rifles appeared on the firing points of competing nations across the 1966 Kingston Games, the 1970 Edinburgh Games, and the 1974 Christchurch Games, each cycle confirming that a rifle designed and built on Bisley Road, Birmingham, submitted to the Proof House on Banbury Street, Bury, and bearing the Birmingham proof mark on its barrel flat, was capable of producing results at the highest level of international competition. The workforce at Bisley Road at the firm's peak employed several hundred skilled workers across barrel making, action fitting, stock work, and the cleaning equipment production lines that continued to underpin the firm's commercial stability. The works occupied a substantial footprint in the Sparkbrook area, its production organized around the integrated model that Parker and Hale had established against the grain of the subcontract tradition, a model that, by mid-century, had proved its logic across 60 decades of consistent output. And then, in 1983, Parker-Hale delivered what should have been the instrument of its own permanent survival. The Model 85, a bolt-action sniper rifle chambered in 7.62 by 51 mm NATO, the standard military rifle cartridge adopted across the Western Alliance following the NATO standardization agreements of the early 1950s, firing a 147-grain full-metal jacket projectile at approximately 2,750 feet per second from a 27.5-inch barrel, was submitted to the British Army's sniper rifle competition as the domestic British answer to a procurement requirement that the Ministry of Defence had been developing since the late 1970s. The requirement was for a dedicated precision sniper system to replace the aging L-42A1, itself a converted Lee Enfield No. 4 Mark I T, whose basic action dated to 1941 and whose service life had been extended well beyond any reasonable expectation. Parker-Hale's Model 85 met the specification. Its free-floating barrel, a design in which the barrel makes no contact with the stock forward of the action, eliminating the pressure variations that stock-to-barrel contact introduces as the wood expands and contracts with temperature and humidity change, produced a level of mechanical accuracy that the MOD's trial evaluators at the Royal Small Arms Factory range at Enfield Lock confirmed was within the required parameters. The chassis was modular, the trigger was adjustable. The Birmingham proof mark was on the barrel. The Australian Army adopted the Model 82, the earlier Parker-Hale precision rifle, as its standard sniper system in 1979. The Canadian Armed Forces followed. New Zealand, India. 6 nations in total had examined what Bisley Road produced and decided that it was the best answer available to them. Britain had not yet decided. Britain was still deciding. And in the time it took Britain to decide, something else had entered the room. The name that entered the room was Accuracy International. In 1985, the Ministry of Defence announced the result of its sniper rifle competition. The winner was the AW, the Arctic Warfare, designed and manufactured in Portsmouth by a company founded in 1978 by Malcolm Cooper, an Olympic shooting champion, and his business partner Sarah Cooper. The L96A1, as the British Army designated it, was a purpose-built precision chassis system whose aluminium bedding block eliminated the wooden stock's susceptibility to environmental variation entirely. A different solution to the same problem Parker-Hale had addressed with its free-floating barrel, and one the MOD's evaluators had judged more comprehensively resolved. Parker-Hale's Model 85 had met the specification. It had not won the contract. The distinction is important. This was not a rejection on grounds of quality. The trial record, as reported in the contemporary Arms Press, indicated that both systems performed within acceptable parameters. The MOD made a procurement judgment between 2 adequate British systems and chose the one that was not made in Birmingham. 6 nations had adopted the Parker-Hale sniper system. The British Army, whose procurement requirement had in part defined the specification that 6 other armies had found satisfactory, would carry Accuracy International instead. The commercial consequences arrived quickly: a domestic military adoption, a formal designation, a contract number, a Ministry of Defence supply agreement was not merely revenue. It was the institutional endorsement that opened export doors that appeared in the trade catalogues of defence procurement agencies on 4 continents, that told every military purchasing officer who examined the question that the British government had examined this weapon and found it sufficient for its own soldiers. Without that endorsement, Parker-Hale's Model 85 entered the export market carrying the implicit question that no sales representative could answer satisfactorily. If it is good enough for Australia and Canada and New Zealand, why is it not good enough for Britain? The question had no clean answer. And in the international defence procurement world, questions without clean answers tend to resolve in favour of whoever has the cleaner answer. Parker-Hale's response to the MOD decision was constrained by a corporate reality that had been developing for several years before the 1985 announcement. The firm had passed through a series of ownership changes in the late 1970s and early 1980s that had progressively separated the decision-making authority over the business from the people who understood what the business actually was. The acquisition by the Ward & Sons Group, a diversified industrial holding company whose interests ranged well beyond the precision arms trade, had placed Parker-Hale inside a corporate structure that evaluated its performance against financial metrics that the target rifle and cleaning equipment business could not consistently satisfy. The investment that a precision arms manufacturer requires in order to remain competitive is not the investment logic of a diversified conglomerate. New production tooling for a target rifle action runs to tens of thousands of pounds and produces a component that will be assembled into a product sold to a market numbered in the hundreds, not the thousands. The calibration equipment required to hold the bore tolerances that Parker-Hale's competition record depended upon requires constant maintenance and periodic replacement. The skilled workers who operated that equipment, the barrel fitters, the actionsmiths, the men whose hands had spent 20 years learning what a correctly bedded action felt like before the measuring instruments confirmed it, were not interchangeable with the workforce of another division of the same holding company. Ward & Sons did not dismantle Parker-Hale in a single decision. It was not that simple, and it was not that crude. What happened was quieter and in some respects more damaging. The investment did not arrive. The tooling aged. The workforce reduced through natural attrition and was not replaced with trained successors. The apprenticeship pipeline, already weakened by the broader collapse of the Birmingham manufacturing apprenticeship system across the 1970s, produced fewer trained hands each year. The knowledge did not transfer to a document. It transferred to a person, and when that person retired or moved on, it transferred to no one. The Firearms Amendment Act 1988, passed by Parliament in the aftermath of the Hungerford massacre of August that year, in which 16 people were killed by a legally held semi-automatic rifle, banned semi-automatic centerfire rifles and pump-action shotguns in mainland Britain. For Parker-Hale, whose catalogue was built around bolt-action target and sporting rifles, the 1988 Act was not the commercial catastrophe it represented for manufacturers of the prohibited types, but it was a signal. It told the market and told the investment community that held companies like Parker-Hale that the British civilian firearms trade was a diminishing asset. The direction of legislative travel was clear, and it was not reversing. The Firearms Amendment Act 1997, passed in the immediate aftermath of the Dunblane school massacre of March that year, in which 16 children and 1 teacher were killed, effectively banned all handguns in mainland Britain. Parker-Hale did not manufacture handguns, but the 1997 Act completed the signal the 1988 Act had begun. The British civilian firearms market, already reduced by 7 decades of progressive restriction since the Firearms Act 1920, had reached its legislative terminus. Whatever remained of commercial firearms manufacturing in Britain after 1997 would survive on export alone. Parker-Hale had not survived to face that question. The manufacturing operation on Bisley Road had already been sold. The decision had been taken, not in Birmingham, not by anyone who had stood on the works floor, not by anyone who had submitted a barrel to the proof house on Banbury Street and waited for the stamp, but by the financial management of a holding company that had concluded, with the logic available to it, that the precision rifle manufacturing business was no longer a viable component of its portfolio. In 1990, the tooling, the jigs, and the gauges were sold to the Gibbs Rifle Company of Martinsburg, West Virginia. The Birmingham proof marks went with them. The Birmingham address did not. At peak, the Bisley Road Works had employed over 300 workers across its production lines. At closure, the number was a fraction of that. The site was cleared. The Sparkbrook address that had produced target rifles for Commonwealth Games competitors and sniper systems for 6 national armies passed into industrial history without a public announcement, without a commemorative plaque, without a mention in Hansard. The capstan lathes went cold. The barrel fitters collected their cards. The proof house submission ceased. The last Parker-Hale rifle left Birmingham. No ceremony attended its departure. None was offered. Parker-Hale cleaning equipment, pull-throughs, oil bottles, chamber brushes, bronze bore brushes in calibers from .1 to .50, continued to be sold through British gun dealers, sporting goods retailers, and military surplus channels long after the Bisley Road Works had been cleared and the tooling shipped to West Virginia. The brand had been separated from the manufacturing operation with the clean efficiency of a financial instrument because that is precisely what it was. A name with 70 years of institutional trust embedded in it. A name on the equipment pouches of 2 generations of British soldiers. A name that the Army Ordnance Corps had placed on supply manifests from Etaples to Alexandria to the Burmese jungle, was a commercial asset that outlived the works, the workforce, and the craft knowledge that had created the trust in the first place. Today, products bearing the Parker-Hale name are manufactured offshore. The Birmingham proof mark does not appear on them. The Bisley Road address does not appear on them. What appears is the name, still recognized, still trusted by a generation of British shooters who associate it with the quality that the Bisley Road Works produced, and who may not know, or may prefer not to examine too closely, where the product bearing that name is now made and by whose hands. In Martinsburg, West Virginia, the Gibbs Rifle Company produced bolt-action rifles under the Parker-Hale license through the 1990s. The Model 1000, the Model 1100, the Model 1200 series, manufactured on the tooling that had left Birmingham in 1990 and reassembled in an American facility by American workers who had inherited the jigs but not the institutional memory of the men who had originally calibrated them. The rifles were competent, they were not. By the assessment of serious collectors who have examined both generations side by side, the same object as a Bisley Road original. The original Parker-Hale target rifles, the Model 82, the Model 85, the earlier Bisley specification match rifles built for NRA competition, are now serious collector pieces in the British and international sporting arms market. Holtz, the specialist firearms auction house, has handled original Parker-Hale match rifles at prices that reflect their competition provenance rather than their mechanical age. The Historical Breech-Loading Small Arms Association, the HBSA, the principal British organization dedicated to the study and preservation of breech-loading firearms and their history, holds records and reference material relating to Parker-Hale's production that represent, in some cases, the most complete surviving documentation of what the Bisley Road Works produced and when. The Royal Armouries at Leeds holds examples of Parker-Hale military and target production within its national collection. The National Firearms Centre at Nottingham, the pattern room collection that preserves the physical record of British military small arms development, holds Parker-Hale submissions and trial examples that document the Model 85's passage through the MOD evaluation process. At Bisley Camp, Surrey, the heathland site that the National Rifle Association has occupied since 1890, the same year that Parker and Hale were establishing the commercial logic that would eventually carry their name to 6 national armies and 3 Commonwealth Games cycles. Original Parker-Hale match rifles still appear on the firing points, not as museum pieces, not as curiosities, as competition rifles, in the hands of shooters who have assessed the available options and concluded that a barrel bedded on Bisley Road, Birmingham, submitted to the proof house on Banbury Street, and bearing the Birmingham proof mark on its barrel flat, still does what it was designed to do more consistently than most of what has been manufactured since. The surprise is not that they shoot well. The surprise is who made them possible. Malcolm Cooper, the Olympic gold medalist whose Accuracy International defeated Parker-Hale's Model 85 in the 1985 MOD competition, the man whose design carried the British Army's sniper capability for 3 decades, had learned to shoot competitively on Parker-Hale equipment. The rifles that lost him the MOD contract had, in the years before he founded Accuracy International, been among the instruments of his own formation as a precision shooter. The competition between them was not between a tradition and an innovation. It was between two expressions of the same British precision shooting culture, one rooted in Birmingham's gun quarter, one founded in Portsmouth by a man that culture had produced. What Parker-Hale represents in the longer arc of British industrial history is not simply a firearms manufacturer that was acquired, rationalized, and dispersed. It is a precise example of what happens when a craft-knowledge economy, one whose value is held in the hands and judgment of individual skilled workers, accumulated across decades of apprenticeship and practice, and embedded in a physical place and its institutional relationships, encounters a financial management culture that can measure revenue but cannot measure what it is about to lose. The Birmingham gun quarter built its reputation across 2 centuries on knowledge that could not be written down, could not be transferred by memo, and could not be reassembled once dispersed. Parker-Hale was not the first Birmingham gunworks to discover this. It will not be the last name to demonstrate it. The Bisley Road site in Sparkbrook has been redeveloped. There is no commemorative panel on the wall. There is no heritage designation on the street. What remains of Parker-Hale in Birmingham is the proof house record on Banbury Street. The submission ledgers, the barrel numbers, the proof marks applied to every barrel the firm ever made, held in an archive that 3 people consult per year, in a city that produced more precision firearms than any other on Earth and retains almost no physical evidence that it did so. And at Bisley Camp, on a July morning when the wind flags on the 1,000-yard range are reading left to right at 3 miles per hour and the targets are white oblongs against the Surrey Heath, a Parker-Hale match rifle, barrel proved at Birmingham, address stamped into the receiver flat, bedded on Bisley Road by hands that are no longer living, cycles its bolt, settles into the shoulder of a shooter who knows exactly what he is holding, and puts the shot where it was always going to go. See you in the next one.